Well, we've got so many questions, and Tom Steve has one there about our federal government and how we're facing headwinds for the advancement of agriculture. We'll get that later. I'm going to ask one more question, and then Lydia has a number of questions that are coming in. I've got some others, but let's go with another one, Ted. Which countries are doing value-added food processing right? And what is the main change you would like to see at the industry level and at the policy level to help Alberta's industry reach a higher global standing in food processing? And of course, I know you know a lot about the Netherlands. You were with Rabobank. Where can or should Alberta lead the way when it comes to investments in ag and ag research? Big question again.
Yeah, big question. Okay, let's get the common theme out of the way first, because everybody tends to answer that question by pointing at the Netherlands. And I'll just say a couple of things about that, and then I want to focus more on the second part of your question. So the Netherlands has done a lot of things right, for sure. But one of the most important things I think they did was to realize that they don't have a lot of land. And you better make damn good use of it, what you got, because it's not a very big place. And so one of the things they did was they invested very heavily in horticulture. And they were smart enough to figure out that they needed to they needed a couple of things. One was they as the horticulture in the Netherlands began to become greenhouse developments, they really became the world's IP center for greenhouse. How do you make horticulture work in greenhouses? So if you're investing in greenhouses in Canada, you're probably using Dutch technology. And then they did another thing. They are also big seed genetics people. So they poured a lot of effort into the genetics side. So they surrounded the industry with smart science. And then finally, they had a banking community that was really favorable to agriculture. And Rabo was one of those. They in fact bank more agriculture in the world than anybody else. And but it came from that mix of IP and fundamentally an identification of what's the real issue. I like to take that that story and twist it a little bit, because really what it's telling you is ultimately your first decision is the most important one. And that is to make sure whatever you're going to develop, whatever you're going to add value to, that you have a fundamental competitive advantage. I see all kinds of people adding value to stuff where I don't understand what the competitive advantage is, then anybody else can do it. So maybe, one of the, a little story close to home for Alberta was the story of how we got involved in the Lethbridge pork plant. And why that. When
you say we, clarify that was.
Sorry, Canada Packers had made an acquisition in Alberta that involved taking over a beef plant in Lethbridge at the time. And Canada Packers those days, or Maple Leaf, was stepping away from the beef business and concentrating on pork and poultry. And they were actually just going to disband this plant, not use it. And but I've been doing a lot of business in Japan, and we've been at those days we were exporting frozen pork to Japan, and but I was very aware of how the Japanese developed chilled pork, or in those days they called fresh pork in Japan, because I visited many of their plants, and and when we were getting rid of this, at the time I was involved deeply in working with. In the U.S. with Hormel. We were exporting Hormel's frozen pork at that time. We had managed to have, by the luck of it, a very, very hot summer in the late 80s, and the Hormel people were doing something very unusual. They were taking a loin, and they were chilling it in ice, cutting it in half because they had no cryovac bags that would fit it, and and then sending it on its way. And it was going to New York City. And the reason they were doing that, as it turned out, when I was down there inquiring, why are you destroying these loins? They said, because our claims coming in from New York City because of the hot summer are so bad that we have to do something. We need to add shelf life. They were getting a shelf life around 10 days, but it's a long way from the Midwest to New York City in those days to distribute the pork in 10 days. And they were getting these claims. I said, how much more shelf life are you getting by putting it in ice? And the answer that came back was, we're getting about a week more. Well, it didn't take much arithmetic to figure out if you could get, be up to 21 days on that, you could ship it to Japan. And the only people supplying Japan in those days was Taiwan. So how does this get back to Alberta? Well, we successfully developed the first chilled pork shipments from North America to Japan out of the Hormel plant by putting a team of people in there. And at that point, when all this was occurring, we had a real interest in doing something in Canada at some point. So we were changing this beef plant over to a pork plant, and I said, why don't we build it from the beginning as a Japanese plant, and we'll send chilled Japanese pork. It was extremely difficult to get anybody in Canada Packers to agree to that, because the reality was, I said, frozen works fine. Why do you want to do that? But at the very end of it, there was two things that stood out to me. There was a strong competitive advantage. First off, what's the competitive advantage for North America itself in both in hogs and in cattle? It's really simple. It's a mathematic rule. You cannot move grain and grass to large animals. You have to move the animals to the grass. So fundamentally, we had the competitive advantage. All the world that doesn't believe that produces lots of meat, they do that because of high subsidies and high protectionism. And we didn't need either one. So that was the first point. The second one was that you can see the difference in the meat if you feed them the right feed. And so what that right feed was barley. So if you feed hogs barley, the fat's whiter. And the meat looks, when contrasted to fat, looks totally different. So we had a built-in competitive advantage on two layers when we started there. And then the third layer of advantage that was, it became a competitive advantage was we decided not to run the slaughter end of the plant the way we do in Canada, but run it like we do in Japan. And the key to that was, there's two issues there. One was that you wind up being able to chill that pork very rapidly, because essentially you take the skin off just like you do cattle, and without that big overcoat on, the meat chills down much quicker, and far less energy required to chill it, and you get a higher quality meat out of that. So that became it was a clear competitive advantage, and everything we did to differentiate on top of that was additional work. So that has worked, David, very well. That plant is still, I believe, the single most profitable per unit pork plant in North America, it tells you that the core to this thing is to differentiate, but to understand fundamentally what your competitive advantages are, and I think, and you can expand that to any of those businesses as you add value.
Okay, yeah, competitive advantage. You did mention yesterday when we were talking that people forget that one of Holland's competitive advantages is they can import raw product, process it, and send it out, and they've got 300 million consumers within the EU.
500.
We've got the US, but that's a difference too.
They have a very protected market relative to what we have with the US. It's very difficult, as we've found, to get access even when we have a trade agreement with the EU. It's very difficult to actually ship the product there. And that's another story for another day. We know why that's the case. But so they have that protected market, but they also had one of the largest and most efficient ports in Europe. And they had the limited agricultural mass of their own, except what they were adding high value to. So they realized their point of difference there. What they could add value to was they could add value to anything in the world that would come into them cheaply through a beautiful port, and then run it into Europe where it's well protected. So they became excellent at they do pork, they do poultry, they do particularly well with vegetable oils and adding value, and dairy, and you can name it. All those things that they bring in and then they add value to.